anyway, and I'll just start by saying that it's a great pleasure to be invited to speak about this kind of subject in this kind of important occasion. Because in my experience, which, as you've heard, reaches back a while, it hasn't always been likely that this kind of thing would happen. When I first started working on my first book, The Animal Estate, more than 25 years ago, the topic was considered unusual and eccentric, not the same thing. It was lucky for me, actually, that Keith Thomas, who of course is a highly respectable historian of early modern Britain, who had previously written about religion, which of course is a highly respectable topic, dealt with animals as well as with vegetation and landscape in his book Man and the Natural World, which was published in 1983. Now, even his interest did not redeem my subject in everyone's eye. I remember just before The Animal State came out, I was invited to give a talk at the Humanities Center at Cornell University, in which the introduction by Jonathan Culler, who's a very distinguished literary theorist, it included the statement, so it was a very different introduction than what I've just heard. He said, "Many weird things have been coming out of the humanities lately, but I think this is the weirdest." Now, at that same visit to Cornell, I also gave a talk at the veterinary school, and there they didn't have any problems of that nature. Of course, it's not surprising maybe that veterinarians should think it was important to study animals. And in fact, I have to say that one of the most rewarding and surprising aspects of my career is that this interest in the history of animals, or of animals and people, has brought me into contact with veterinarians, zoo curators, animal breeders, people who are concerned with animals themselves. But of course, like any scholar, what I also yearn for is the understanding of members of my own discipline, and gradually that has come to pass. By placing a mirror as people exit from the ape house, saying this is the last member of the ape family. And if we look in the dictionary, we can find a similar doubleness of vision. So if we look at the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, definition of animals, there's one sense, which is illustrated with learned examples from the Middle Ages to modern scientists, that includes all living things that aren't plants, essentially the definition that I've been using. But there's another sense, which is illustrated mostly with literary quotations, non-experts, which is less inclusive and obviously much more popular. So that is, to quote, "In common usage, one of the lower animals, a brute or beast as distinguished from man." So again, an attempt to classify animals ends up implicating human categories as well, in this case, in a way drawing the distinction between the more learned and the less learned. So most Victorians, if we look back a century or so, would have explicitly acknowledged the robustness of the boundary between humans and animals, despite long-standing challenges. Now, the most intellectually formidable of these challenges, of course, was the theory of evolution, or to put it in the terms of the 18th century, the notion that the chain of being represented relationships that were dynamic rather than static. Now, evolution wasn't Darwin's ideas, I'm sure you all know. His grandfather Erasmus wrote a long poem about it, but it did problematize intraprimate resemblances that, again, were already obvious. So from its beginnings in the 18th century, most formal taxonomy, scientific classification, recognized not only the many general correspondence between people and what were then known as quadrupeds, christened mammals by Linnaeus. This is him in his collecting outfit. But they also recognized the particular similarities that human beings shared with apes and monkeys. And in particular, the details that were most compelling and in a sense most problematical were the non-functional ones. That is, our ears, the same, our fingernails. And on this basis, not only did Linnaeus locate people firmly within the animal kingdom, but he constructed the primate order to accommodate humans, apes, monkeys, prosimians, and bats. Or fleas or worms. I mean, both kinds of claims are interesting, and both are true. That is, I think they're true. But they make sense in different contexts. That is, in different human contexts, of course. Again, the non-human context is ultimately a matter only for speculation, but I would say that the world is probably differently organized in the view of cats or beavers or hippopotami. If they organize the world in binary terms, it's not probably the human-non-human binary that feels natural to most people. Certainly the experience of Coco, the gorilla, a longtime resident of Palo Alto, California, who has shown romantic interest in male humans and has experienced the pleasures of pet ownership, suggests an alternative taxonomy, and so, as probably most of you know, does the behavior of many domestic dogs. But when people using this general animal rubric make similar claims on behalf of creatures much less similar to us and defend them in terms that apply to our fellow mammals or even our fellow vertebrates, the rights of, say, lobsters, oysters, termites offer ready targets for ridicule. That doesn't mean that the claims aren't right, but it does say something about their likely effect. And again, I have to say, this is a historically specific observation. The distinction between the reasonable and the ridiculous looks very different at different times. If we look back a couple of hundred years, we see that Mary Wollstonecraft's vindication of the rights of women was travestied on the grounds that if you granted these rights to women, cows and sheep and pigs would be next in line. Although possibly they are still next in line. So anyway, these most sweepingly inclusive or most powerfully reductive, to put it in a different way, categories make more sense, I think, for scientists than they do for scholars in the humanities and social scientists. But it's still far from the recognized core of any of them. It remains marginal in many disciplines, and not the same thing. It's often on the borderline between disciplines. But this awkward set of positions is also the source of much of its appeal, even its intellectual power. Their very marginality, that is the marginality of animals, allows the study of them to challenge settled assumptions and relationships, to re-raise some of the largest issues both within the community of scholars and also in the larger society to which scholars and their subjects both belong. And so I'll just end by returning to Levi-Strauss. He said, animals are good to think with, and of course they, or we, are good in many other ways as well. Thank you.